husband and a great father. Somebody you could really respect and admire. Another really good answer. So finally, the friend that came up with this question in the first place, he has to give his answer. And he's already heard two pretty good ones, so he had to come up with his own kind of unique answer on his own. So he said, well, at my funeral, as people are thinking about me, talking about me, looking on me, this is what I want them to say about me. I want them to say, look, he's moving. That's what I want them to say at my funeral. Wouldn't that be great if they could say that about you? He's moving. Well, that actually happened to a man in South Africa. He was suffering from an asthma attack. His family assumed he was dead. The undertaker was called, and he thought the man was dead too, so they took him to the morgue. This is a true story, by the way. They took him to the morgue, and about 20 hours later, two workers at that morgue, which happened to be at a Sunday morning as well, two workers heard screaming in the back of the morgue because that man was not dead. He was alive, and he woke up there at the morgue. Now, if you were that man right away, what would you want? Those workers to come and get you, right? They didn't do that. Instead, they ran out the front door because they were so afraid of what happened. They were just scared to death. They thought it was a ghost or something. But finally, they went back, and they got the man out, and he thankfully got to go home back to his family alive. I can only imagine what the conversation was like after that fact. He went home and they had to explain, well, we thought you were dead, and you really weren't. Never happens, right? That somebody is dead and then comes to life again. It never happens until you go back to that first Easter. There was Jesus, and he truly was dead. Some of you were with us for worship on Good Friday, and we went back and we read through John's Gospel, and we saw that Jesus Christ truly was dead. The Romans knew what they were doing when they crucified people. And just to ensure that Jesus had died, they thrust a spear into his side, piercing his heart, ensuring that the Lord of life had died. That evening, his body was placed inside the tomb. A large stone was rolled to the front. Two Roman soldiers were posted so that nobody could mess with that tomb. It was obvious Jesus had died. Then Easter comes along, and Matthew tells us that two women are heading to his tomb. And as they make their way there and arrive, they find the unexpected. They find what nobody believed was going to happen. We pick up their story today in Matthew chapter 28. I invite you to turn there with me if you'd like to follow along in our gospel reading. Matthew records for us that first Easter and what happened when those women arrived at the tomb. It tells us down in verse 1. Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. First Easter occurs, and there's a large earthquake. An angel from God comes down out of heaven, and the two Roman soldiers posted there at the tomb are literally scared to death. I mean, you can imagine they just can't even move. They're so afraid of what is happening. Can you really blame them? In fact, what we're going to see throughout this account here in Matthew is that really everybody was afraid on that first Easter. Everybody was scared of what God was doing on that day. But first, let's think about those soldiers. These soldiers had seen a lot in their time. Roman soldiers that had been involved in gruesome battles, and no doubt they had been trusted to guard several other important things there in the empire. But they never thought that they were going to be face to face with an angel sent from God. See, for them, Jesus was just another teacher, another person in a long line of people that had been crucified by this empire. But here on this Easter, everything has changed. They're standing face to face with this angel sent from God. And next to them is this tomb that is supposed to have Jesus inside, but he's not there. He's not there because he's risen. And perhaps the most frightening thing for these men of all is that now they are seeing the reality. God is real. God actually exists. And right here at this point in history, he's proven it. They are scared to death. Maybe that seems kind of weird to us today. I mean, we're here at church celebrating the resurrection, somehow believing God is real, so it doesn't seem like something to be afraid of, but when you're a couple of Roman soldiers who have never believed in this God, all of a sudden maybe that prospect seems kind of frightening to you. Because all of a sudden they are seeing the reality that they're not God. It's kind of a newsflash for all of us today. We're not God. We're not the ones who rule over everything, even our own little individual lives. None of us can stand and say that we are a self-made individual. Because here at the empty tomb, the Lord has proven he is the real thing by his crucified Son being risen from the dead. The soldiers see that, and they're afraid. But they're not alone in that. The women see it, and they're afraid too. We pick up the rest of their story, starting at verse 5. It says, the angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen. As he said, come see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you. The women journeyed to Jesus' grave that day, expecting to find what everybody finds at a grave or at a tomb, the lifeless body of that loved one. The women, though, shouldn't have expected it to be this way. Countless times throughout his ministry, Jesus had said, I'm going to die, but then I'm also going to rise. Somehow throughout all that teaching, though, that always got lost in translation. And when you think about it, would you believe it if somebody came to you today and said, well, you know what, I'm going to die, but don't worry, a couple of days later, I'm going to rise back to life. You'd maybe have a little bit of a hard time believing that, wouldn't you? But for the women, they did. So they're journeying to the tomb, and they've got spices in their hands because they're going to anoint Jesus' body, and they're expecting the worst. So they don't really want to get their hopes up. You ever been like that in life? Have you ever had a time where you just didn't want to get your hopes up about things? Maybe you're kind of one of those people that assumes the worst and, maybe sort of slightly hopes for the best. Well, that was the women there on that Easter. Assuming the worst and really kind of not even hoping for the best. They didn't want to get their hopes up. Then God changed all that. God changed that expectation of death from it being this permanent thing to Jesus giving life. And that was really a hard thing for them to understand because we're always told death is supposed to be permanent. We're always told in life, there's two things you can count on, right? Death and taxes. And no matter what we do, we can't get rid of either one of them, right? Same thing is true here. Some of you know my dad is a plumber. And so he gets to see a lot of different people, meet a lot of different people going to their houses and that sort of thing. This last week, he was at the home of a 91-year-old woman that he's known for quite some time. He's done a lot of work for her. And she took him into her garage, and she said, hey, John, I've got something I want to show you today. So he goes, and he sees it in the corner of the garage. There's something that's been very carefully placed inside that garage. And it turns out it was the woman's gravestone. One side had her birth date on it. The other side was blank. She told my dad, I'm not sure why she told him all these things, but she told him, well, my husband already used his, and I'm just waiting to use mine. That's what we expect, right? we expect the worst. We know death is this inevitable thing. But as we travel back to the tomb with the women, we all of a sudden find out that that expectation is kind of blown out of the water. Now we can actually hope for the best, can't we? We can get our hopes up on Easter because of the angel's words. Not here. He's risen. This Jesus is alive. And if the women thought that day that this is an incredible thing, just coming to the tomb and seeing this angel, they hadn't seen anything yet. Because Jesus himself was about to appear to these women. Take a look with me at verse 8. So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see." Imagine the day these women are having. They've already come face to face with an angel. But now, their Lord and Master, who they had just witnessed die this horrific death, meets them on the road. The one that they had watched be placed inside this tomb, completely dead, now stands before them, fully restored and alive. They fall at his feet and they worship. What an amazing moment for those women. And the truth of the matter is they are not hallucinating. Because time and time and time again, Jesus would appear to them and to his other disciples. For 40 days, Jesus did this so that everybody would know, them and us, that he really had risen from the grave. That what happened that Easter wasn't some sort of story or hallucination or anything like that, but was the real thing. The Apostle John, one of those witnesses, said this in his letter, 1 John. "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life." John says, we saw it all right. We experienced Jesus. All of our senses were involved. We saw him, and we heard him. We even touched the risen Lord. The resurrection is real. God himself, his Son, is real. That empty tomb proves it. It's significant that Jesus would come down to these women and to the disciples. That's what Jesus always does. Jesus always comes down to his people to get rid of our fears and to prove that he is God. Why did you come here today? Maybe for some of you, you came because it's Easter. You always come to church on Easter, right? Maybe for some of you, maybe you wanted to stay in bed this morning. You could be honest about that. Maybe you wanted to get a little more sleep today. Maybe somebody kind of drug you in, kicking and screaming, because you were tired. But the real truth is that the Lord brought us here today. I really believe that. Because God always comes to his people to prove that he is real, to dispel our fears. That is what worship really is. Worship is not, hey, let me see what I can pack into an hour and give to God. Worship is actually when the Lord comes to us, showing us what he has done, showing us that he is real. That's what happened here. And notice what Jesus said to the women. He said, "Do not be afraid." Even though they're seeing all these amazing things, what are they? They're still kind of afraid of it, aren't they? No problem for Jesus. He just simply comes to them and he says, don't be afraid. Because that's what this God of grace and mercy always does. He desires to have life with us, even when we're afraid of what that might mean. And so here with the women, he just draws them in and he says, don't be afraid. You don't have to be anymore. And I don't know what's going on in your life. And I don't know what it is that makes you afraid or maybe troubles you right now. But those same words apply to us. Don't be afraid, because Jesus is alive. The story of a missionary who lived in Brazil. He happened to stumble across a village of people that were living in a very remote part of the jungle. This village was going through some terrible times. There was a disease that was spreading through all of the people, and many of them were dying. They could get help, but in order to do that, they were going to have to cross this river that was on the border of the village. And that was a big problem for them. See, the people in this village believed that there was an evil spirit lurking in the waters of that river. And there was no way they were going to cross that river. Even if it meant the whole village was going to die, they were not going to cross that river, because they believed that evil spirit was lurking in that water. The missionary saw their need, and he knew he could get them help. So he sprung into action. He said, I've got to convince them to get across this water and get help. So the first thing he did is he told them, I went through the water. I'm here. I'm okay. But they didn't believe him. Then he reached down into that river. He got a handful of that water. And he said, yeah, I'm still okay. Still weren't convinced. Finally, he kind of waded into the waters of that river, got in about waist deep, splashed some of it up in his face to show everything's okay. They're still hesitant about it. So finally, the missionary decided to just dive right into the water, swim underneath it, come out onto the other side of the shore, and stick his fist into the air triumphantly, so they could finally get the point that if you go through this water, everything will be okay. Once he did it, and once he stood on the other side of the shore with his hand in the air, the villagers cheered, because they finally realized there was nothing to be afraid of. And they could follow this man and go get the help that they needed. There's something for us to learn in that today. Because Jesus has been through the most fearful of things. He has suffered immensely. And he has died. But now he lives. He's come out of the tomb. And we can almost picture Jesus as being that one with his fist in the air, saying that he has brought triumph even over the grave. We said those words this morning as we started our worship. Death lost, because Jesus lives. When you stop and think about that, maybe even think about the things that bother you and make you fearful in life. Does it change things to go back to that tomb and see Jesus risen and alive? It can. It did for those women. It did for those early disciples. We are here some 2,000 years later because it has for countless people. We don't have to be afraid. Jesus Christ is risen. We don't even have to be afraid to put all our eggs, if you will, into God's basket. Because Jesus is alive. Who do you want to follow? What do you want to live for today? The one who's risen from the dead? Or the things in this life that kind of come and go, jobs and stuff and feelings? Don't be afraid today to live for Jesus. He is the only one who is risen from the dead. And he promises to every single one of us who believe in him that the same will be true for us. The only thing we're going to find with God is that we live. Let's go to him now and pray. Heavenly Father, today we see it with the women. Jesus is not in that tomb. He has risen. He is alive. Lord, you know all the things that scare us in life. Things we admit, maybe things we keep tucked away. Lord, help us not to be afraid any longer. Help us not to be afraid to believe and to live for you. Because Jesus is not in the tomb. He is risen. We pray in his name. Amen.